Yes, yes. So Alicia and Laura are here to talk through our Step Up to Quality changes as well as the licensing rule review. So I will turn it over.
Thank you. And had I known my colleagues were going to be here, they could do this much better than I can. So if you see me look to my right, it's my fun of friends over there. So my name's Alicia Leatherman, and I work at the Department of Children and Youth. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer, which means that training, technical assistance, and policy that our department is working on across that very big continuum that the director spoke about, from prenatal to children's services and children turning 21 and being out of our system, it is crossing that range. So we're really trying to look at how to make things easier for professionals who may be transitioning, for families who may be transitioning, or who may not need something until their child is 10 or 8, or how are we picking up families and how are we being responsive? So that is the pleasure of the work that I get to do every day. And my colleague Laura Graff, she's the Deputy Director of Policy. She'll be coming up and talking about the licensing work that's going to be happening over this next year. So we have a lot to try to cover in 30 minutes with these two topics. So I'm going to hit some pretty high level updates. So in case you haven't heard, we've made a few changes to Step Up to Quality and a few things related to this. So just walking through, the biggest thing is that, we were at a point in time, as we do often and as any system that's working with people, data, outcomes tries to do, is we took a look at where the system was and what changes we thought would be needed. There also happened to be a study. The legislature had a Step Up to Quality study that convened over, I think, 18 months. So there were recommendations that really were about how to improve Step Up to Quality from a variety of lenses. And so we went to work taking those recommendations and thinking about where we were, and made the decision to transition from the 5 stars. And Judith, those of you that have worked in the field remember our little loose sites that we gave to rated programs with the 3 stars. So I happen to have one of those in my office that I will keep forever and ever and ever. But now we have transitioned from the stars to our levels, our medal levels, gold, silver, and bronze. Just coincidentally happened to roll that out the year of the Olympics. I mean, it was just a coincidence. But we still are maintaining that notion that we do have a difference between rated and highly rated or not rated. And so you can see on this slide that the transition from where we went with the 1 through 5 to where we are with gold through bronze, how that change is happening. We've had a lot of information sessions with providers, and we still are answering that question around highly rated. And so it really is silver and gold. In terms of our implementation timeline, we on purpose, we know we did a lot of things very quickly in terms of making decisions, implementing our rules, making these changes. But this really truly is a year of transition where we're still working out modifications. An example of that is the classroom observation tool. So we're taking all of the data that we've been gathering, and we're looking at what worked and what didn't, and taking feedback from providers and making some changes that we'll test with that tool through this year, in enough time that we can train people on it, share what those differences are before we roll it out in July will be our goal for when we will think about a new OCOT. So this year is really, how do we make those revisions? How do we make sure our staff are trained? How do we make sure providers are trained and the field is trained before we implement? So you'll see a theme around a number of the items that we're working on. It is on purpose that we took this year to be a transition year so that we could take time to have some of those things work out. We are in the process, so Stevie and Michelle and the regulatory team at our department are busy with the new applications and assessing programs under the new rating. So if someone is interested who hasn't been rated and becoming rated, or someone wants to change their rating, they are eligible to apply under the new standards. But if you're a person who you're like, I was a 5, I got my gold rating, I'll see you next year, that's okay with us too. That's okay. because the more variability we have in the timing, we don't want our colleagues to have a June where there are 2,000 programs who are trying to get reassessed for their rating. So it really does work out for all of us that we have this year of transition so that we can keep some of the timelines that we've had. And I do have some numbers, but I know these change daily, so you all can help keep me honest on those. So we really have tried through this process to talk about the why. We know that's really important when it comes to changes that are being made. So one of the things that on the why is implementing quality standards, again, taking a pause and looking at what's happened nationally. I happened to pop out of the early care and ed world for about 8 years, and wow, the difference that happened between national NAEYC accreditation, between Head Start performance standards, between just the trends around quality rating and improvement systems. I've been pretty amazed at how much changed, how much didn't change, but those things in particular, like how we define quality, how the federal government was defining quality, really changed. So we need to take a look at how things are what's happening at the national level, and where can we really focus on the greatest difference for families. As Director Wente mentioned, we know that our readiness, our children demonstrating readiness at kindergarten is around 35-36%. So we also were looking at, are there decisions that we can make about this quality rating system that can change those outcomes for kids? Are there things that we really need to push more, things that we can let go of because we don't think it necessarily got us as far as we needed it to with our goal of having kids demonstrating? We also wanted to reduce administrative burden. So getting feedback on the process, what needed to get submitted, how that process worked. So we wanted to take a look at that so that programs could really focus on what's happening in those classrooms every single day rather than filling out paperwork for us. And then this one is an interesting one because on one hand, we want to provide programs with flexibility, particularly in the use of forms that they may already use, systems that they already have. But we also took away a little bit of flexibility, which is in our high quality rating. For 4s and 5s, we had points that programs could earn. We also decided to pull back on that and have a more consistent definition across the board of what highly rated meant. And so those points, those extra things that individual programs could opt for, those are gone. So we got clear about our definition of quality, but we did take a little bit of flexibility for how people got there. So just a few things, and I'll whip through these really quickly. So since I've talked about that, I did want to talk about the curriculum, implementing a curriculum. So especially when we were looking at the Step Up to Quality stakeholder in the legislative group, it's hard for people to understand that we have a standard that says you have to have it, but you don't have to use it. You don't have to implement it, you don't have to understand it, but you got it in plastic on a shelf in the closet. So the biggest decision that we made is really requiring, if you're gonna have that rating outside of your building, outside, when families search, that you have to be implementing an evidence-based curriculum that is aligned to the science of reading and the early learning and development standards. And we are working with our colleagues at the Department of Education and Workforce to have that two-step process happen. We do have different windows and a different pace, and we do know that this is an area where we are behind. But I think we sent out like 18 letters last week or the beginning of this week or something. So we're really excited about that. But we are working through the process of making sure that those approvals are happening. And again, with this transition year, we're saying to people, keep doing what you're doing, and if we need to have that conversation, if we go to do that alignment and there's something about it that you have to change or work on, we'll work through that with you. But we're working through that process. As the director mentioned too, we also are purchasing, will make available to every single licensed program, and we will work through, do you get one per age group, one per classroom? How is it gonna work? Likely it'll be one per age group. But we want to make, if people choose that they would like to utilize this free curriculum, when we select this curriculum, hopefully by the end of October, it will already be aligned. We will have already gone through the process of ensuring that it's aligned to the early learning and development standards and the science of reading. So when we go to put it out, that process has already happened. In addition to making that resource available to every licensed program, we also will have a vendor who will help people take that and then work through implementation. So every couple of weeks, there'll be a webinar that'll be available and recorded for people where the vendor will go through how to take a lesson and how to incorporate that into your classroom. What are the tips? What are the ways to think about implementing it, working through it, but taking chunks of that curriculum at a time and making resources available to teachers. So as soon as we have that information in those schedules, we'll make sure that we post those broadly for people to have. I mentioned reducing administrative burden. So the amount of documents what has to be submitted is really very small compared to what it was previously. Forms, we do have sample forms available that say to folks, here's an example if you don't have something in existence. But the team, the regulatory team is also working through ensuring that programs who have systems in place and documents in place and forms in place are able to use them as long as they meet the expectations and the standards. So we're really trying to make sure, again, that the focus is really on what we want to see in that program and in the classroom rather than what we see on paper. We really want to be able to observe it in a different way. So removing some of that burden. And then I mentioned flexibility. So again, this one is for me, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. We added flexibility on some of the documentation and some of the requirements, but we did remove some of the flexibility around being highly rated. So as of last week, I think, these are the numbers. Thank you, Stevie, for, this is all the hard work, but a couple of things that we wanted to note. One, the system is actually working all of its way through. People have actually been rated under the new system, so we're really excited about that. We also wanted to share with you all just the numbers of currently rated programs so that you can see the volume of programs that are still rated. And of course, we will track this obsessively over the next year to see how these numbers change over time in terms of new programs or people moving or changing ratings or people who maybe have to decrease their rating. We obviously will be tracking this really, really closely. And as of today, almost 60% of all of our licensed programs are rated. So that's another big number that we'll be looking at. Did just want to remind everyone that there are exemptions to being rated. So listed up here, the easiest way to talk about these is if you're a family child care provider, you're not required to be rated. And if you have a publicly funded child care provider agreement, but you serve less than 25% of your families are publicly funded, you do not have to be rated. So we have a good chunk of people that don't have to mess with this at all, but who choose to. So our family child care providers, for instance, completely exempt, but over 95% of family child care providers are rated in our state. So we just really love that fact. We honor them for the work wanting to continually improve, and while the exemption exists, we still are going to pretend that everybody can do it, everybody needs it, we want everybody in, and we'll continue to work because, again, part of this is about defining quality, but the majority of the push in the early days of quality rating is to give families better tools to select a setting that works best for them, and knowing that there are differences in quality helps them make some choices. The system is still a building block, so in order to be gold, you have to meet silver and you have to meet bronze, so everything builds upon each other. And as I mentioned, there's no longer the points. So I just, with the time that we have, I'm not going to go into all of the individual standards, but I do just want to mention a couple of things. So we have reduced the number of standards. So there are things that we have removed. So professional development plans, for an example, is something that that is no longer required in terms of the standards, or a transition plan. There was a lot of transition planning. But a lot of things are the same. So I think everyone is kind of expecting that, we threw it all up and it's all different. But the first question that our team always asks is, how should we do this? My first question is always, how did we do it before? Like, are we keeping it the same, or are we changing it for a reason? In a lot of cases, the things that worked well, we kept and we're doing the same way. But we have tried to consolidate and move them. If you participate in our early childhood education, our early care and education stakeholder calls that we have monthly, you've been on this journey of ratio with us. It is clearly the biggest point of contention out of all of the standards. It got the most varying opinions and views about it. And we tried our darndest to we believe that ratios are really important. We also recognize that there are economic realities to reducing ratios. At a time when the field is trying to rebuild and we're trying to expand access for families so that they can work and that more children have access to high quality. So this is where we landed for GOLD programs, center-based, school-based, not family childcare. We are asking that we can see 40% of the ratios are reduced when our team is out in the field. Learning and development, we've really, kind of talked about the curriculum piece. We will also, at some point, so around assessments, I just want to say for those of you that also are familiar with or work with programs who are teachers who are doing the early learning assessment. So the early learning assessment that is required for preschool special ed and for the early childhood education grant, the number of indicators that are scored for that process have been reduced to 15. In order for it to count as a comprehensive assessment for Step Up to Quality, the entire thing has to be completed. But that's not the only assessment, obviously, that can be used. So one of the other things that we'll be looking at is for the state curriculum that we choose, if there is an assessment that comes along with that curriculum, we really want to start looking at what are the core components of an assessment that are really important, that regardless of the curriculum you're using, the assessment tool that you're using, that there are common elements that we can see. So just want to mention some of those changes that we went through. Staff qualifications, we have a handy dandy little chart here that helps you see by level, kind of who has to meet what. A couple of key changes around staff quals and professional development is that we have gone from the 20 hours over 2 years to 10 hours per year to try to allow some flexibility. We also, for the teaching staff, for the staff in the program and the administrators, we are also trying to define the topics that we would love for them to get their professional development in. They have to try to get those 10 hours per year in 2 topics, but we are working through specifically with the science of reading requirements, or the Pathway G and the Cox campus options for infant, toddler, and preschool. We also are trying to make sure that people understand if you take one of those series or go through that series, we know that there's more kind of integrated into those trainings than just the science of reading. So we'll provide some guidance on that. But these topics really came from the field and what the field was saying about hiring. The director mentioned that 33% turnover. So as we're thinking about a third of new teachers coming in every year and needing those 10 hours, where can we really build some foundational knowledge and skills with the staff that are coming in? And I'm sorry to rush through these, but I want to make sure you guys have time for 4 or 2. The last thing that I will mention is, again, we're a work in progress. We are in a transition year, but we do have materials that will be available. We just had a lovely conversation this morning on a different call about the family tab and making sure we've really been focused on trying to make sure that the resources that providers in the field need are getting up to date, and we'll continue to load them into and onto the site. But we also will have companion information for families on our website as well, which is one of the tabs that we have. And this just shows where you can find the new standards that I've referenced today. The last thing that I want to mention is that we do have regional meetings that started last week that are happening across the state between now and November. I texted my colleague and said, if there were a room of higher ed professionals who wanted to register for those sessions too, is that good? And they said yes. So all of those sessions are in the Ohio Professional Registry. If you are hosting, I know some of you, like I saw Owens and other places, thank you for hosting us, but also for helping to be the messenger and helping people understand these changes. So please, they'll be recorded. You can attend in person, or you're also able to join those virtually. And if those sessions, they're 3 hours, so they go into more detail about some of the things that I've highlighted today, please feel free to join, have colleagues join. It's really important that the leaders in this field understand the why and the how, because we know you're the ones who may be getting some of the questions about how the new system is working. So resources will be here, those regional meetings, and we are going to put, I think, all of the slides from the regional meetings, we're going to have them up on the website as well, hopefully next week, so that people who are attending those sessions can download them prior to attending. Yes?
I just wondered, can you clarify a little more? I didn't quite understand what you meant about the ratios reduced by 40%, did you say? So.
Sorry. So 40% of the, groups, not classroom, groups, 40% of the groups need to have, and we do have a chart to reflect the expectations around there. So our team will look at how many groups that program has, regardless in total. And in 40% of those groups, they would expect to see those lower ratio and group sizes.
So the chart, would that be on this site here?
Yes.
And then also the chart with the professional development levels?
Yes.
That is also on this site?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Yes.
I have a couple of questions. So about the topics, when will we know more about aligning what's already been previously approved to those topics? And can you tell us what, number one, where environments would go? What bucket would environments go into? And what does critical conversations mean?
So I will try to answer the first question. So there's a team that's been working with the Professional Development Registry. The goal is to have these items and professional development in the registry sorted by those topics. So people will know if it meets one of these topics, that alignment is happening. But I don't know, Judith, if you have a time frame for that.
We're waiting on some definitions to be able to move that forward, but we will provide an extensive communication as far as time frame and what to do to make that happen.
So one of those definitions may be waiting on what is a critical conversation.
Okay.
So that really, so I think we tend to think about those as having difficult conversations with staff, with parents. Motivational interviewing is another kind of topic that we talk about in terms of how do you approach conversations with families that may be challenging or difficult. How do we help families if there are questions, or if a teacher has questions about a child's development, how do they approach that family to be able to have that conversation? But it's also, every day teachers are put in a situation where
There's a critical conversation.
that's right, something may happen between, so it's really around communication
Okay.
and building communication skills
Oh, that's great.
amongst staff.
And will there be the option to back map previously approved trainings to the topic areas? Or is this only moving forward with new content?
It will have the opportunity to go back to approved content, and you'll hear us use the term clone,
Oh,
so
okay,
that you can then add those topics
okay.
as appropriate.
I have another question about any updates about the CPL level changes.
We do have a work group, but I have not gotten an update recently on that. But we can try to, we can try to provide an update at one of our future meetings, or on the website about those changes. But we've been gathering recommendations on what that could look like, what that should look like moving forward. And my assumption is we'll probably try to get some broader. We've had a group that reflects all provider types that have been giving us feedback, and my assumption is we'll give the larger field an opportunity to weigh in because it's such a big, important topic before we would implement anything. So I'll get an update and make sure we get that on a future call.
And I have one more question. With the ELA, any talk about allowing infants and toddlers to, the original intent was that infants and toddlers would be able to be assessed using the ELA because it is a continuum. Any talk about returning to that model?
I think we want programs that are serving infants and toddlers and preschoolers to have an option to look at assessment in a continuum. The use of the ELA, I think we're looking at its long-term use, or whether we would try to work with programs on the assessments that they choose that best align to the evidence-based curriculum they're using, and how to think about supporting them with using the assessments that come with the curriculum. So I wrote down, infant, toddler, and the continuum is something that we definitely will be looking at and thinking about and planning for, but I just don't know if it'll be an add-on to the ELA or if it'll come in a different form or with different guidance. If that makes sense.
To go back to one of your first comments on a question, as higher education, if there are people who are taking, let's say, guidance and management, a 3-credit-hour college course, and they upload their transcript, will that then continue to count toward those hours?
It will.
And it will fall under one of these
It will.
areas?
And it will, and we also are looking at other opportunities like national conferences, state conferences, special webinars. The group is also trying to look at how, with consistency and clear expectations, how can we also look at professional development that people may be getting elsewhere as well. But yes, it will count.
I have a question on the curriculum that you're choosing. Do you have an idea? Is it absolutely play-based? Is it, I know there's this huge trend in elementary schools to go to scripted lessons, which are really tying teachers' hands. Where is this curriculum? Is it still developmentally appropriate for our youngest children?
Well, we certainly hope so. So in the RFP, so a couple of things that we're hoping help with that is that we are requiring the selected vendor, it will be appropriate for infant, toddler, preschool through the continuum. It also has to be aligned to the early learning and development standards before we select it. So
Unfortunately, you can align to the standards and still have a scripted curriculum.
So I will take that specific question. I am not on the review committee, but Dr. Grove, I guess I probably shouldn't say who's on it, but other people from our department are, and I will get that question specifically addressed, and we'll try to provide like a Q&A specifically about that when we release information about the curriculum that we select.
But they won't have to use that, like they can use a different curriculum as long as it meets the requirements, right?
Yep, it is completely voluntary. It is not mandatory to use that curriculum, but we just want to make sure that people know that the resource is available. And again, this is the first time that we're opening it up to all licensed programs. Before it was really focused on only providers who had a publicly funded childcare agreement. So this is a new opportunity. So there may be a lot of districts that are thinking about and asking about this free curriculum because it's the first time they've had access to it. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Laura to talk about our regulatory process. Thank you all very much.
Okay. The good thing is I'll be quick. This is very straightforward. I know I'm between you and lunch, and I noticed you only have 30 minutes for lunch. So that would be a problem if it was me. And Alicia will tell you I get hangry if I'm not to eat lunch. So this is all about kind of just a broad overview, but again, it's very straightforward. As the Deputy Director for Policy with the department, it is the new department, it is the transition period, so we're bringing all these programs right into one kind of policy area. And so my job is to basically coordinate the efforts to kind of open up all these policies and look across the various places that came over, the settings, right? The home-based settings, the facility-based settings, and kind of just look to see, what exists where and what's in the federal regs, what's in the revised code, like what are we held to that we don't have flexibility? What are we not held to that we do have room for flexibility? How do we align across all of these various programs? So that it's simpler, it's easy to absorb from a consumer perspective. And then also just looking at the complexity and the rule structure. So it's really starting to just kind of expose all the rules based on various topics, and then getting stakeholders, internal stakeholders on board, and then obviously moving it to gauge external stakeholders, and then obviously drafting kind of what the new rules would look like. So just really diving in to figure out where we can align, if we can align, if we can't, we can't. But then also just making the rule written in plain language, because how many times do you read a rule and you're like, what is this saying? And so making it easier to just kind of interpret the rule, and then just kind of point blank. So this is a massive project, right? The first phase of it is to look across licensing, and licensing is the ECE, the foster care, the residential, and I believe there's over 1,500 requirements written in 198 rules. So at a minimum, we're rescinding 198 rules and basically going to file new rules to replace those rules and come up with kind of that recommended requirement across the board if we can. And so our first thing, again, like just what's federal regs that we can't change, what's in revised code that we could maybe, if we rally up and get some effort behind it, we might be able to change, and then the administrative rules that we can hopefully weigh in on. And so engage with stakeholders, draft the new regs. Okay, so these are the categories, the early care and ed core rules. These are all the types that go into that blue box. Then you've got your foster care, all the types that go into the foster care, and then the residential facilities, all that go into that box. And then step up to quality, we've kind of lumped into ECE. So, and clearly you've already kind of done some of these, so I'm hoping that maybe that will be the leader for touching the other areas, because they were just recently opened and they were streamlined as much as possible, I'm assuming. So coming in, I'm hoping that we can kind of use that to trickle to our other areas. So that's the category-based core rules. And again, here we'll show you, the goal is that if I'm a residential facility, that I will basically go, and depending on what type of residential facility, I'll have two rules to look at. I'll have the minimum requirement for that residential facility, and then if I'm a children's crisis care, I'll go to that second rule. So you're not going to 10 different rules, you're going, and the rules will be structured the same. So if background checks is paragraph C for a residential facility, background checks will be paragraph B for ECE and through these. So if there isn't a requirement based on, in that paragraph, it'll just list there's no additional requirement from the minimum umbrella kind of core rule, if that makes sense. And so the structure alone, just kicking this off, the structure alone, if we go back to right here, you're talking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 individual chapters that have all background checks within those individual chapters. So where it's the same, it's one rule, right? Like you have one rule up here, and then if there's something different that we know registered day camps is very special, right? So they're kind of off on their own. But where we can align and what we can call out as one rule across all of these, we will. And so it's just going to be that. It'll just be so much better to read from the start, right? And then where we can do that in the other areas, we will. And so that's the project that we have ahead of us. So that's, hopefully you guys will kind of hear about this as we move in the upcoming, and we kick off the calendar year for 25. Does anybody have any questions?
I have one.
Yeah.
So as we look at this, when you're saying these rules, how do public preschools, I know you have a preschool in here, but preschools that are in schools, and then they also have to align with K-12 rules, how are you laying that on top of this?
So
Specifically, the background check rules that are so very different and create such headaches for those of us in higher
Yes.
ed.
We don't want to create more headache. Let me put that out there. And we don't want to create any more red tape than there already exists, especially around background checks. So that's something that obviously the federal rules kind of dictate, especially for CCBDG. Did I say that right? Okay. But for publicly funded childcare, so those that have the publicly funded childcare, they're going to have more those restrictions, because that's where those regs are brought in if there's PFCC. Otherwise, it's going to stay the same. It's you're a teacher's license. You've met that requirement. There are some things I think that you might do now, and especially for the PFCC side. But we're trying as much as possible to recognize if you're, and this is kind of where we're going, and I don't know exactly what's going to be plugged in where, because it seems like it may just be a solid guidance. But if you've had a background check for this, for early intervention, if you've had a background check with your employer, right, we should respect that. You've already gotten that for them. You don't need to get it for us, as much as possible within the federal regs, right? So I think we're looking at what do we have to require from a federal perspective, but where can we just have guidance across the board? Is it that mom or dad or parent, guardian releases that child to be alone with that speech therapist while they're in the setting? So like, where can we give guidance? And I think that's what your question was. So the bottom line is we don't want to create any more red tape, especially around background checks that already exist. So it's not adding more. If anything, it's trying to eliminate confusion and figuring out where we can add clarity. Yeah.
So just speaking on behalf of some of the higher ed people, I don't know if there's room for this, but if there could be a special designation for college students or student teaching people within these regs, that would provide us with our own sort of requirements and then help them allow us in more often. Because there's a lot of things that make it so we have to form our classes a certain way because we have so many requirements for them to just go in and teach a couple of hours. They can't go teach a art lesson for 2 hours without a physical.
Right.
So that's insane.
Right.
So if there's any room to like add that as a category,
Yeah.
like a college student or like a student teacher, as opposed to, because we're always like, are we a volunteer? Are we an employee? Like it's kind of this weird, and
the gray
different
area.
centers don't know how to interpret it differently.
Yes.
So that would be a suggestion for the
Yes.
committee as you're writing these. That would be super helpful for us, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it goes back to interpretation, giving that guidance where we can be clear and everybody that comes together is clear that this is the understanding and these are the scenarios, and just to have it be consistent. Well, that's definitely part of this
And one
conversation.
code, could we please have one code?
And one
Put
code.
that down as a note,
I
one
want to
code.
speak to the importance of what Gail brought up
Yeah.
about these codes. This is a real issue.
Oh, it's a huge
Yeah.
issue.
And I can see
Huge.
with more public preschools, I see this being a real thing that needs to be addressed. So I'm just kind of saying I agree with that. Because public schools are funded by, I don't know if it fits under PFCC, but it's public funds, right? So that preschool is gonna fit under that. So that is a major issue for us. So if you could put it on that priority, I mean, it's really important for us. And so what happens at the 2-year level, they have to have a certain background check. And then they have to go and they get another background check. So that could even be within like the same year. And it's redundant. And so even if they made the early childhood code what everybody needed, it would make everybody's life easier. But there's these two different codes, as Andrew said too. But it's huge.
Yeah. And that's what's due, right?
And
That's
it's costing
their
our
It's
students
very
a lot
big
of money.
difference.
with
It's
Department
very
of Ed.
expensive.
Okay. And
a lot
that's
of
not
implications for us.
PFCC.
It, just to be in the
Just-
child care, right,
the child-
yeah.
okay,
For our students to go out, there's a certain code, even
okay.
if they go get the medical,
Gotcha,
so that
right.
they can get that.
Yes.
That's a certain code, but then when they go into public schools, for their K through 8
Right.
observations, it's a different code. It's not, so, but now we're gonna have this issue because of more pre-K, school, preschools going into public schools.
Yeah.
So we need, as Andrew said, one code that meets, whatever the requirements are. So maybe to use the federal guidelines, if those are, we have to meet those or something like that, then that's the code for everybody, whether you're in pre-K through 12, whatever your background check is. So it,
Yeah, yeah, I mean, there's conversations we need to have with it is the Attorney General's revised code where all of this lives. And so I want to be realistic too, where we can make change, it might take some time, but that's the end goal, right? We want to make it easier, exactly. We want to hear you, we hear you, and we want to work to make that easier. So there's going to be some conversations that we'll have to have with other entities, which takes some time, but that is the end goal. So I will say that, however we can make it easier, we will.
we appreciate the opportunity to express.
Yeah, for sure. We've heard that, yeah.
And if it makes it easier, I've had conversation with some of the friends that are around that background check when the 5104 started. And they said Ohio was so extreme the other way. They're like, they totally warped the intent of the federal.
Well, and that's what I was going to say. That's another thing is interpretation. And this could be
Yep.
TA where we get that clarification from the feds and we ease up on something that we've been interpreting one way when really it's, so that's definitely a very good
I got that
point.
interpretation 5 years ago. We're still fighting it. Yeah, I've written, I've advocated, I've put it out there.
Send me
we're
whatever you
still
got.
fighting it. So,
I'll give you my email. You can send me whatever you got. We'll definitely read it and follow up and do what we can.
Laura, can I just mention, I know Judith is about to pull us, but we do have, we are establishing a work group who will meet with us. So the way that we're working through this is we have a team that's spending time going through the every sentence in the rules, believe it or not, and determining, do we need it, do we not, why, what are we really going through that, and then every 2 to 3 weeks, we are gonna have this external stakeholder group that whatever we've reviewed internally, we're bringing in front of them for them to give us feedback throughout this entire process. And that includes school districts, ESCs, family childcare, A's and B's, for-profits, not-profits. We're Head Start. We're trying to think about it from a standpoint of who all needs to be going through this process with us. When it comes to some of the issues that you all are bringing up, we obviously need to do some reach-ins when it comes to some of the background checks and the staff qualifications and requirements. So we hope that you all, if we reach out with some asks or some questions about the direction that we're moving in, we just hope that you can be available to provide us with some feedback through that process. But we are trying to make this, to get feedback real time through the process as we go as well.
Thank you. Thank you.